Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday morning. Had to think there for a minute. I've been so busy this morning. I've just been, up to here in research and writing and what have you. And I filmed Monday and Tuesday's video, and then I took a break to go back to do some writing and some research. So I just now sat down and go, wait a minute, is this for Tuesday or Wednesday or what is it? Yeah. So, anyway, welcome back to Morning Musings. And we are continuing our examination of this concept. Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following is about the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. Now, remember, I've shared with you that in the amillennial and to a certain extent, even in the Reformed circles, postmillennial circles, although there's a caveat that goes with it, there is the view that God was through with Old Covenant Israel. God was through with the Old Covenant at the cross. And by the way, dispensationalists tell us that God was through with the law of Moses at the first century, at the cross. Thomas Ice says the law of Moses was completely fulfilled and done away with in the first century. So you have all three futurist eschatologies that say, on one hand, okay, the entirety of the old law has been done away with. But then they start hedging. And they say, well, okay, the law itself, the sacrificial system, the cultus, the sacrifices, that was done away with. But guess what? Then the dispensationalists turn around and say, yeah, the animal sacrifices were done away with in the first century, but we're waiting for the fulfillment of the final three feast days, which were sacrificial feasts. Well, was it done away with or not? You see the problem? And then, of course, as I mentioned, the postmillennialists, they tell us the law of Moses was removed in the first century, nailed to the cross. Many of them in their writings say that. But then they turn right around and say they are waiting for the yet future conversion of ethnic Israel at the end of the Christian age in fulfillment of the Old Testament. And then, of course, there is the amillennial view that I've already enunciated quite a bit. So when you start examining the futurist views of eschatology, you run into all of these different views. It's literally a hodgepodge out there. So what I've been setting forth for you, sharing with you, is the fact that Matthew chapter 25 anticipated the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. Now, again, I'm not going into a full discourse on the implications of this based on Matthew 5, 17 and 18, where Jesus said, do not think that I came to destroy the law of the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, until heaven and earth passes away, not one jot, not one tittle shall pass from the law. Well, very quickly, all three futurist views tell us, well, a lot of the jots and a lot of the tittles of the old law have passed away. The sacrificial system. But then they say, well, part of it remains. Well, wait a minute. Jesus said not one jot or one tittle shall pass until it's all fulfilled. So it's improper to say some is past and some remains. Keep that in mind in light of Matthew chapter 25. Matthew chapter 25 was anticipating the fulfillment of Sukkot, as we saw a couple of videos back. Sukkot was an intrinsic element of, quote, the law. Leviticus chapter 23, Numbers chapter 28, and other chapters as well. So here is a fundamental aspect of the law, i.e., the feast days. And the final three feast days anticipated the judgment, the coming of the Lord, the resurrection. So that ought to mean until the final three feast days, an intrinsic element of the law, were fulfilled in the judgment, the coming of the Lord, the resurrection, then none of the law could pass. And yet, it's so common to read, especially in the amillennial literature, that we are absolutely not waiting for the future fulfillment of any of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. God was through with them at the cross. I have been accused of false doctrine, of heresy, simply based upon the fact that I have quoted in my books the fact that the New Testament writers, long after the cross, long after Pentecost, said they were looking for the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. Now, I shared with you in Acts chapter 3. And look, I don't know how in the world you get around that passage. Peter was anticipating the coming of the Lord, the second coming, and it was foretold in Samuel and all of the prophets who foretold that second coming and the restoration of all things that would be consummated at that second coming. Now, by the way, I made the comment that there are no New Testament or no new eschatological promises in the New Testament. They're all the reiteration of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. I made those statements in my formal 2-day public debate with Steve Gregg in Denver, which was organized by my good friend Mike Zeman. Did a great job, by the way, in organizing it. So anyway, Steve got up and denied that. Even though I quoted from Paul repeatedly that he taught no other things than what Moses, the law, and the prophets said should come to pass, Steve denied that. And I'll share with you what Steve said about that when we come to examine Paul and eschatology and Matthew chapter 25. But for today, I want to drive home the point that I did in Acts chapter 3, Acts 2 and Acts chapter 3. And that is that Peter's eschatology was based squarely on, taken from God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. Thus, until those Old Covenant promises were fulfilled, then God's covenant with Israel would remain valid. Because you see, those promises, those eschatological promises, were part and parcel. They are the warp and the woof of God's covenant with Israel. So go with me to 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 Peter chapter 1 is really an amazing passage. By the way, I produced a 19-part video series on the eschatology of 1 Peter. It's available for both download as well as purchase of the MP3s as well as the DVDs. So you can purchase the download MP3s or DVDs off of my website. And I tell you what, folks, there's nothing else like it out there. You really need to avail yourself of that. So in 1 Peter, the apostle is writing to the saints who are being persecuted. They are the diaspora. They are the 10 tribes scattered abroad. He's not writing to the Gentiles, as I was taught growing up. So it says, "Blessed be the God and the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has begotten us again unto a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, to an inheritance incorruptible, undefiled, that does not fade away, which is reserved in heaven for you, who are kept by the power of God through faith." Now watch this. "For salvation that is ready to be revealed in the last time." Now, we are told repeatedly, salvation was already a reality from Pentecost or from the cross onward. Well, that's strange. Peter was anticipating the revelation of salvation that was ready, from the Greek word hetoimos, which means not only morally prepared, but temporally imminent. Okay? And that salvation ready to be revealed. But watch this. "In this you greatly rejoice, even though now for a little while, if need be, you are being grieved by various trials, that the genuineness of your faith, being much more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ." Now, Listen, multitudes of scholars see that Peter here is drawing from Malachi chapter 3, that in the last days, the remnant would be tried by fire, purified by fire, so that in the day that the Lord would make up the jewels of his crown, they would receive eternal life. You know, Gregory Beale calls attention to those connections. So anyway, what? So you have salvation ready to be revealed in the last time, and you have Christ who is about to be revealed. Well, you see, Hebrews chapter 9, verse 28, to those who eagerly look for him, he shall appear a second time apart from sin for salvation. Now, once again, ladies and gentlemen, if salvation was completed and it was an objective reality from the cross onward, how could they be looking for salvation to come at the revelation of Jesus Christ? The idea that salvation was completely finalized at the cross or Pentecost is absolutely specious. It's untenable. It does not work. But watch. Whom, speaking of Christ, of course, whom having not seen, you love, though now you do not see him, and yet believing, you rejoice with joy inexpressible and full of glory, receiving the end. That's the Greek word telos. Receiving the goal of your faith, that is the salvation of your souls. They were, that's a present participle. They were in the process, not had received it. They were in the process of receiving the goal of their faith, the salvation of their souls. Isn't that beautiful and isn't that powerful? Now watch this. Of this salvation. What salvation? The salvation of their soul, which would come at the revelation of Jesus Christ, which was still future. That is, therefore, the revelation of Jesus Christ and the salvation of the soul of Matthew chapter 25, right? You're going to talk about two different comings of Christ, two different comings of Christ for salvation. Salvation of the soul. Now watch. Of this salvation, the prophets have inquired and searched diligently and carefully, who prophesied of the grace that should come unto you, searching what manner of time the Spirit of Christ who was in them was indicating when he testified beforehand the sufferings of Christ and the glories that would follow. Folks, what prophets what prophets foretold the sufferings of Christ and the glory to follow? Well, Daniel 9 is one of them. After the 69 weeks, the Messiah would be cut off, but not for himself. And then what would follow? Oh, everlasting righteousness, the world of everlasting righteousness. Isaiah 53, the sufferings of Messiah. So here is Peter anticipating the coming of Christ for the revelation of salvation that was ready to be revealed, and that salvation had been foretold by the Old Covenant prophets. Now, again, ladies and gentlemen, remember, the Jewish feast days foretold in the law, Leviticus 23, Numbers 28, anticipated and foreshadowed the good things that Paul said in AD 62 or 63, whatever, were about to come. They were still future. So the salvation to come at the judgment, the coming of the Lord, the resurrection, that salvation foreshadowed in the feast days of the law was about to be fulfilled. It was ready to be revealed in 1 Peter chapter 1. It's therefore absolutely, totally false. Folks, do you catch the power of this? It is totally false to deny that New Testament eschatology is based upon, taken from, and was the anticipation of the imminent. I mean, how much more imminent could the language be indicating? Ready to be revealed. ready to be revealed in these last times. And by the way, those old covenant prophets searched and inquired diligently to know the manner and the time. And it was revealed to them that not unto themselves, in other words, not in their day, the salvation would come. It would come in the last days. Well, Peter said they were living in the last days. Acts chapter 2, 15 and following. Old Testament prophets, far off. Old Testament prophets, not for their day. Peter, but unto us it has been revealed. And he goes ahead to say in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 5, Christ was ready, once again, the Greek word hitomos, standing ready, temporally ready. Alford's Greek Testament says the Greek reader would have understood this of the imminent judge. Christ was ready to judge the living and the dead. The end of all things has drawn near, and the time, the appointed time, the divinely appointed time for the judgment has come. How much clearer could it be? So, here is Peter talking about the salvation to come at the second coming of Christ, which is the coming of Christ of Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following, and saying that fulfillment of that judgment, of that parousia, of that resurrection, was ready to be revealed. That means that Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following was not predictive of a far distant future coming of the Lord, judgment and resurrection. It was to be fulfilled in the first century. Okay, out of time for today. Now, tomorrow, I'm going to pick up on our response to objections to my brand new book, Temple to Telos. Now, there have been several objections lodged in response to the last video. So I'm going to take the time to respond to some of those objections, which I consider to be, which I consider to be argumentum ad desperatum. Pardon me. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you on the flip side.